This internal voice can be relentless. And for a long time, you may have believed it was helping you, motivating you, keeping you accountable. But as you develop this capacity to question interpretations, you begin to see this voice differently. You begin to recognize that it's not motivating you. It's draining you. It's not keeping you accountable. It's keeping you anxious. And you begin to question it, to challenge it, to ask whether its assessments are actually accurate or whether they're just reflections of old fears and unrealistic standards. You're not doing enough. Really? By whose measure? And is that measure even reasonable? And even if you could do more, does that mean what you're doing now is worthless? You should be further along. Further along than what? Than whom? And who decided what the timeline should be? And is this comparison even useful, or is it just making you miserable? Everyone else has it figured out. Do they? Or are you just seeing their external presentation and assuming it reflects their internal reality? And even if they do have some things figured out that you don't, does that mean you're failing? These questions dismantle the automatic authority of the internal critic. They reveal it as just another voice, another interpretation, another story that you don't have to believe just because it appears in your mind. And as you practice this questioning, as you refuse to automatically accept every negative thought as truth, something begins to shift. The internal critic becomes quieter. Not gone, but less dominant. Less convincing. Less able to destabilize you with a single thought. And in the space that opens up, other voices can emerge. Kinder voices. More accurate voices. Voices that recognize your efforts, acknowledge your growth, appreciate your progress. Not in some artificial, forced positivity way, but in a realistic, grounded way. In a way that sees you clearly, including your imperfections, and still finds you worthy of respect. This internal shift, from automatic self-criticism to thoughtful self-assessment, parallels the external shift you've been making. From automatic acceptance of others' judgments to thoughtful consideration of whether those judgments are accurate or useful. In both cases, you're reclaiming your authority. You're deciding what you believe rather than passively accepting whatever interpretation first appears. And this is not easy. It requires constant practice, constant awareness, constant choosing. Because the old patterns are deeply ingrained. The automatic interpretations happen faster than conscious thought. The familiar stories feel true because they've been repeated so many times. But each time you pause, each time you question, each time you choose a more accurate interpretation over an automatic negative one, you weaken the old pattern and strengthen the new one. And over time, the new pattern becomes stronger than the old. The pause becomes more automatic than the reactive interpretation. The questioning becomes more natural than the automatic acceptance. This is when you begin to truly live unbothered. Not because you've eliminated all negative thoughts or all external judgment, but because you've changed your relationship to them. You no longer take them at face value. You no longer let them define you. You no longer collapse under their weight. You can observe them, consider them, learn from them when appropriate, and release them when they're not serving you. And this capacity to engage with judgment without being controlled by it is what creates lasting peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on everyone approving of you. Not the temporary peace that comes from avoiding all conflict. But the stable peace that comes from being grounded in yourself, regardless of external circumstances. This peace doesn't mean you never feel hurt by criticism. It doesn't mean you never wish people understood you better. It doesn't mean you're immune to the sting of judgment. It just means those experiences don't devastate you the way they once did. They don't send you spiraling. They don't make you question your fundamental worth. They don't pull you so far off center that you lose yourself. You can feel the hurt, acknowledge it, process it, and return to your center. You can wish for understanding without needing it to feel okay. You can notice the sting of judgment without letting it poison your sense of self. This resilience is not something you're born with. It's something you build. Through practice. Through repetition. Through the consistent choice to return to center, even when it's uncomfortable. And as you build this resilience, you begin to notice another benefit. You begin to notice that your relationships improve. Not because you're trying to improve them. Not because you found some new strategy for getting people to like you. But because you're showing up differently. You're showing up as someone who's grounded rather than desperate. Someone who's genuine rather than performing. Someone who can be present rather than constantly scanning for signs of approval or disapproval. And this groundedness, this genuineness, this presence, these qualities naturally deepen connection. They create space for real relationship. They allow others to relax around you because they can sense that you're not needing something from them. You're not needing them to validate you. You're not needing them to approve of you. You're not needing them to see you in a particular way. You're just being. And that simple act of being, unencumbered by the need for approval, is often more compelling than any performance could be. This doesn't mean everyone will appreciate it. Some people are more comfortable with performance. Some people prefer relationships where everyone is playing a role, maintaining an image, keeping things surface level. And when you stop performing, those people might become uncomfortable. They might distance themselves. They might even criticize you for changing, for not being who they expected you to be. And that's okay. Because the relationships built on performance were never sustainable anyway. They required constant maintenance. Constant adjustment. Constant suppression of who you actually are. The relationships that remain, or the new ones that form, are built on something more solid. On authenticity. On mutual respect. On the recognition that both people are allowed to be themselves without constant performance. And these relationships, while perhaps fewer in number, are deeper in quality. They're more satisfying. More nourishing. More real. Because you can actually be yourself in them. You can share what you really think without filtering it through layers of will they approve? You can express what you really feel without worrying about whether it's the right thing to feel. You can simply be present, and that's enough. This is what becomes possible when you live unbothered. Not a life free from judgment or challenge. But a life where judgment and challenge don't have the power to destabilize you. Where you can remain centered even when the external world is chaotic. Where you can stay grounded in who you are even when others don't understand. Where you can maintain your sense of self even when faced with criticism or disapproval. And this stability, this groundedness, this centeredness, these are not luxuries. They're necessities. Because without them, you're at the mercy of every opinion, every judgment, every shift in how you're perceived. But with them, you're free. Not free from external judgment. That's impossible. But free from being controlled by it. Free from letting it determine your worth. Free from abandoning yourself in pursuit of it. And that freedom is not something you achieve once and then possess forever. It's something you practice. Daily. Moment by moment. In small choices and large ones. In the choice to speak honestly even when it might not be well received. In the choice to set a boundary even when it disappoints someone. In the choice to honor your own needs even when others don't understand them. Each of these choices reinforces your center. Each one strengthens your sense of self. Each one reminds you that you can trust yourself, that you can stand by your values, that you don't need constant external validation to be okay. And over time, these choices accumulate into a way of being. A way of moving through the world that's both connected and boundaried. Both caring and self-preserving. Both open to others and grounded in yourself. This is the balance you've been seeking. Not the extreme of complete dependence on external approval. Not the extreme of complete detachment from others. But the middle path. The grounded path. The path of living unbothered, not careless. And as you continue on this path, you may notice moments of backsliding. Moments when someone's judgment hits harder than expected. Moments when you find yourself seeking approval again, adjusting again, performing again. And that's not failure. That's just being human. The patterns you're working with have been reinforced over years, maybe decades. They won't disappear completely. They'll resurface, especially in moments of stress or vulnerability. But the difference is that now you recognize them. Now you can see them happening. Now you have the tools to respond differently. You can notice that you're seeking approval, and you can choose to redirect your attention back to your own center. You can notice that you're adjusting out of fear, and you can choose to honor your truth instead. You can notice that you're collapsing under judgment, and you can choose to question whether that judgment actually defines you. These choices, made consistently over time, are what create lasting change. Not perfection. Not the complete elimination of old patterns. But a steady shift toward groundedness, toward centeredness, toward living in a way that feels real rather than performed. And in that shift, you find what this whole journey has been about. Not approval. Not validation. Not the certainty that everyone likes you. But something far more valuable. Something that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Something that remains stable even when the world around you is shifting. You find yourself. Your real self. Not the performed version. Not the adjusted version. Not the version that's been shaped to fit what others expect. But the version that knows what it thinks, trusts what it feels, and stands by what it values. The version that can be present in the world without losing itself. The version that can care about others without abandoning itself. This version has always been there. Beneath the performance. Beneath the adjustment. Beneath the constant scanning for approval. It's been waiting, quietly, for you to remember it exists. For you to stop looking outward for validation and start looking inward for truth. For you to stop performing and start being. And now, as you continue this practice, as you keep choosing centeredness over reactivity, authenticity over performance, integrity over approval, that version becomes stronger. More present. More accessible. Until one day, you realize it's not something you're trying to access anymore. It's just who you are. Grounded. Centered. Unbothered. Not because nothing affects you, but because you've learned to remain stable in the midst of whatever does. Not because you don't care about people, but because you've learned to care without losing yourself. Not because you're immune to judgment, but because you've learned that judgment doesn't define you. This is what living unbothered looks like. And it's available to you. Not as some distant ideal, but as a lived reality that you're building, moment by moment, through the simple practice of remaining centered in who you are. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's unpopular. Even when no one else understands. Because in the end, the only understanding that truly matters is your own. The only approval that sustains you is internal. And the only life worth living is one that's actually yours. Not shaped by fear. Not dictated by others' opinions. Not performed for an audience that may not even be paying attention. But real. Honest. Grounded in who you actually are. This is the path. And you're already on it. Chapter 2: Emotional Hijacking Under Stress. There is a moment that occurs before a mistake is made. It does not always announce itself. It does not always feel like a warning. But it is there, somewhere in the space between what you sense and what you decide to do about it. Most people do not notice this moment. They move through it without awareness, and by the time they recognize what has happened, the decision has already been made. The consequence is already in motion. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is not a lack of experience or preparation. It is something else entirely. It is the moment when emotion takes over the process of thinking, and thinking becomes secondary to feeling. You may have experienced this before. A situation becomes tense. The stakes feel high. Something inside you tightens, and suddenly the clarity you had moments ago is gone. You are still aware. You are still present. But the quality of your awareness has changed. It has narrowed. It has become reactive. This shift happens quickly. So quickly that most people do not realize it has occurred until they are already acting from within it. They believe they are still making rational decisions. They believe they are still in control. But the framework through which they are interpreting the situation has already been altered by the pressure they feel. This is what happens under stress. The emotional system responds faster than the reasoning system. It interprets threat, evaluates risk, and prepares the body for action before the conscious mind has finished processing what is happening. This is not a flaw. It is a design feature. It is meant to protect you. But it does not always serve you. When the stakes are low, this system works reasonably well. You feel something. You respond. The outcome does not matter much, and even if it does, there is usually time to recover. But when the stakes are high, when the margin for error is small, this automatic response can become the very thing that creates the problem you are trying to avoid. The difficulty is that stress does not feel like a distortion. It feels like clarity. It feels like urgency. It feels like the situation demands immediate action, and anything less than immediate action would be a failure to respond appropriately. This is where many people lose their way. They mistake the intensity of their feeling for the accuracy of their perception. You may notice this in others before you notice it in yourself. Someone under pressure becomes rigid. Their thinking becomes narrow. They fixate on a single outcome or a single threat, and they lose the ability to consider alternatives. They are not calm. They are not open. They are locked into a single mode of response, and they defend that mode with increasing intensity, even when it is clearly not working. This is not stubbornness. It is not poor judgment. It is emotional hijacking. The feeling has become so strong that it has overridden the ability to think flexibly. The person is still capable of reasoning, but their reasoning is now being used to justify the feeling, rather than to evaluate the situation. This happens to everyone. It happens to people who are experienced. It happens to people who are trained. It happens to people who have been through similar situations many times before. The emotional system does not care about your experience. It responds to what it perceives as a threat, and when it perceives a threat, it responds in the way it has always responded. The question is not whether this will happen. The question is whether you will notice it happening. Most people do not. They are inside the experience, and from inside the experience, everything feels justified. The urgency feels real. The threat feels immediate. The response feels necessary. It is only later, when the pressure has passed, that they look back and realize they were not thinking clearly. But by then, the decision has already been made. This is the cycle that repeats itself. Pressure arrives. Emotion takes over. Clarity is lost. A decision is made from within that clouded state. The outcome is poor. The person reflects afterward and tells themselves they will do better next time. But when the next time arrives, the same thing happens. The same pattern repeats. Why does this happen? Why do people who have made the same mistake before, who have reflected on it, who have committed to doing better, still find themselves making the same mistake again when the pressure returns? It is because reflection after the fact does not change the automatic response in the moment. Understanding what went wrong does not, by itself, change what happens when the emotional system is triggered. Knowledge is not the same as control. Awareness after the event is not the same as awareness during the event. The emotional response is faster than the thinking response. It is more immediate. It is more forceful. And when it arrives, it does not wait for you to remember your past mistakes or your past resolutions. It simply acts. This is why people repeat the same errors under pressure. Not because they have forgotten the lesson. Not because they do not care. But because the lesson was learned in a calm state, and the mistake is made in a stressed state. These are not the same conditions. What you know when you are calm does not automatically transfer to what you do when you are not calm. The mistake most people make is assuming that if they understand something intellectually, they will be able to apply it when it matters. They believe that insight is the same as capability. But insight is only the beginning. It tells you what needs to change. It does not, by itself, change it. What needs to change is not your understanding. What needs to change is your response in the moment. And that requires something different. It requires you to notice the shift as it is happening, not after it has already happened. This is more difficult than it sounds. The shift is subtle. It does not always feel like a loss of control. It often feels like increased focus. You become more alert, more concentrated, more determined. But underneath that intensity, something has changed. The flexibility has gone. The openness has gone. You are no longer responding to the situation as it is. You are responding to the situation as your emotional system has interpreted it. The emotional system is not concerned with accuracy. It is concerned with survival. It interprets quickly, and it interprets with bias. It assumes the worst. It overestimates threat. It underestimates your capacity to handle complexity. This is not a mistake. It is a feature. In truly dangerous situations, it is better to overreact than to underreact. But most of the situations you face are not truly dangerous. They are stressful, but they are not life-threatening. The emotional system does not always make this distinction. So it responds as though the stakes are higher than they are. It narrows your focus. It speeds up your sense of time. It pushes you toward action, even when action is not the best response. And because this all happens so quickly, you do not realize you are being pushed. You simply feel the urgency, and you respond to the urgency, and you believe that the urgency is real. This is where the problem begins. Not in the emotion itself, but in the belief that the emotion is an accurate reflection of the situation. When you feel intense fear, you assume there is something intensely fearful. When you feel overwhelming pressure, you assume the situation is overwhelming. But the intensity of the feeling is not always proportional to the reality of the situation. Sometimes the feeling is a magnification. Sometimes it is a distortion. You may have noticed this in hindsight. You were in a situation that felt unbearable. You were convinced that if you did not act immediately, something terrible would happen. So you acted. And later, when you looked back, you realized the situation was not as extreme as it felt. The urgency was not as real as it seemed. The threat was not as immediate as you believed. This does not mean you imagined it. The feeling was real. The pressure was real. But the interpretation was not accurate. And because the interpretation was not accurate, the response was not appropriate. This is the nature of emotional hijacking. The system is designed to err on the side of caution. It is designed to assume the worst. And in moments of high stress, it takes over the process of evaluation and replaces measured judgment with immediate reaction. The difficulty is that this process feels seamless. You do not notice the handoff. You do not feel the moment when emotion steps in and takes the lead. You simply feel that the situation is urgent, and you respond accordingly. But if you slow down the experience, if you observe it carefully, you begin to notice that there are different layers to what you are feeling. There is the raw sensation of pressure. There is the interpretation of that pressure. There is the story you tell yourself about what the pressure means. And there is the decision you make based on that story. Most people experience all of this as a single event. They feel pressure, and they act. But it is not a single event. It is a sequence. And within that sequence, there are points where you can intervene. There are points where you can pause. There are points where you can choose a different interpretation or a different response. But you cannot intervene if you do not notice the sequence unfolding. And you cannot notice the sequence unfolding if you are entirely absorbed in the intensity of what you are feeling. This is the challenge. When stress is high, attention becomes narrow. It focuses on the perceived threat. It focuses on the need to resolve the situation. It does not focus on the quality of your thinking. It does not focus on whether your perception is accurate. It focuses only on the urgency of the moment. And when attention is narrow, awareness is limited. You see what the emotional system wants you to see. You interpret what the emotional system wants you to interpret. You respond in the way the emotional system has prepared you to respond. And you believe, in that moment, that this is the only reasonable way to proceed. This is why people make the same mistakes repeatedly. Not because they lack intelligence. Not because they lack information. But because in the moment of stress, the emotional system overrides everything else. It does not matter what you know. It does not matter what you have learned. What matters is what you feel, and what you feel in that moment is designed to push you toward rapid action. The question, then, is not how to eliminate this response. You cannot eliminate it. It is hardwired. It is automatic. It will always be there. The question is how to notice it. How to recognize when it is happening. How to create enough space between the feeling and the action that you can choose a response, rather than simply reacting. This is not easy. It requires a level of self-awareness that most people do not naturally possess. It requires you to observe yourself in the moment, even when the moment is intense. It requires you to step back, even when everything inside you is pushing forward. It requires you to question your perception, even when your perception feels absolutely certain. But it is possible. And it becomes more possible the more you practice it. Not by thinking about it afterward. Not by analyzing it when you are calm. But by noticing it in real time, in the moments when the pressure is present and the emotional system is active. You begin to notice the signs. The tightening in your chest. The narrowing of your focus. The sense that you must act now, that any delay would be a mistake. These are not signs that you need to act. These are signs that your emotional system has been activated. And once you recognize that, you have a choice. You can follow the urge. You can act on the feeling. You can do what the emotional system is telling you to do. Or you can pause. You can take a breath. You can ask yourself whether the urgency you feel is proportional to the situation you are in. Most people never ask this question. They assume the urgency is real. They assume the feeling is accurate. And so they act without questioning. But the act of questioning, the simple act of pausing to consider whether your perception might be distorted, is often enough to break the automatic pattern. It does not require you to analyze the situation deeply. It does not require you to figure out the perfect response. It simply requires you to notice that you are in a reactive state, and to recognize that decisions made in a reactive state are often not the best decisions. This recognition does not make the feeling go away. The pressure is still there. The urgency is still there. But you are no longer entirely inside it. You have created a small amount of distance. A small amount of space. And in that space, you have the possibility of choosing differently. This is where the shift begins. Not in eliminating the emotional response. Not in becoming immune to pressure. But in noticing when the response has been triggered, and in choosing not to act from within it immediately. Over time, this becomes easier. The more you practice noticing, the more familiar the pattern becomes. You begin to recognize the early signs. You begin to sense when your thinking is narrowing. You begin to feel when the emotional system is taking over. And you begin to respond differently. But this does not happen by itself. It does not happen simply because you want it to. It happens because you train yourself to notice. And you train yourself to notice by paying attention in the moments when it is hardest to pay attention. When the pressure is low, it is easy to be aware. It is easy to observe yourself. It is easy to maintain perspective. But when the pressure is high, awareness collapses. perspective is lost. And this is exactly when awareness is most needed. So the practice is not to be calm when things are easy. The practice is to notice when things are difficult. To observe yourself when the stakes are high. To recognize when the emotional system has been activated, and to pause before acting on what it is telling you. This does not mean you ignore the emotion. The emotion contains information. It is telling you something. But it is not always telling you the truth. It is telling you what the emotional system believes to be true, based on its rapid, biased interpretation of the situation. And the emotional system is not always accurate. It overestimates threat. It underestimates your capacity. It assumes the worst. It reacts as though the situation is more dangerous than it is. This is not a flaw. It is a feature. But it is a feature designed for a different kind of threat than the ones you typically face. The threats you face now are not the threats your ancestors faced. They are not immediate physical dangers. They are social pressures, performance demands, financial risks, relational conflicts. These are real. They are stressful. But they are not the same as being chased by a predator. The emotional system does not always make this distinction. So it responds to a difficult conversation the same way it would respond to a physical threat. It responds to a financial setback the same way it would respond to an immediate danger. It activates the same systems. It creates the same sensations. It pushes you toward the same rapid, automatic responses. And if you do not recognize this, you will act as though the situation is more urgent than it is. You will act as though you have no time. You will act as though the only option is to respond immediately. And in doing so, you will often make the situation worse. This is the cycle. Pressure triggers emotion. Emotion distorts perception. Distorted perception leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions create more pressure. And the cycle continues. Breaking this cycle does not require you to become less emotional. It does not require you to suppress what you feel. It requires you to recognize what is happening. To see the process as it unfolds. To notice when emotion is driving the decision, rather than informing it. There is a difference between these two. When emotion informs a decision, you feel something, you acknowledge it, and you consider it as part of the larger picture. When emotion drives a decision, you feel something, and you act on it immediately, without considering anything else. The first allows for flexibility. The second does not. The first leaves room for judgment. The second does not. The first integrates emotion with reason. The second replaces reason with emotion. Most people, under stress, move toward the second. They do not do this consciously. They do not choose it. It simply happens. The emotional system takes over, and reason becomes secondary. And because this happens automatically, they do not realize it is happening. This is why the same patterns repeat. This is why people who have reflected deeply on their mistakes still make the same mistakes when the pressure returns. Because reflection happens in a calm state, and mistakes happen in a stressed state. And the two states do not operate by the same rules. In a calm state, you have access to your full cognitive capacity. You can think clearly. You can consider multiple perspectives. You can weigh options. You can plan. But in a stress state, that capacity narrows. You lose access to flexibility. You lose access to nuance. You lose access to the very tools you need to make good decisions. And yet, this is precisely when decisions matter most. When the stakes are high. When the margin for error is small. When the outcome will have lasting consequences. This is when you need clarity the most. And this is when clarity is hardest to maintain. So what do you do? How do you maintain clarity when everything inside you is pushing toward reaction? How do you stay grounded when the emotional system is pulling you in a different direction? You start by noticing. Not by trying to change it. Not by trying to fix it, but by simply observing it. You notice when your chest tightens. You notice when your breathing becomes shallow. You notice when your thoughts start racing. You notice when you feel the urge to act immediately. These are not signs that you need to act. These are signs that your emotional system has been activated. And once you recognize that, you have a choice. You can act on the activation, or you can pause and allow the activation to settle. Most people act immediately. They feel the urgency, and they respond to the urgency. They believe that if they do not act now, they will lose the opportunity. They believe that hesitation is weakness. They believe that speed is strength. But speed is only strength when the direction is correct. And when the emotional system is driving, the direction is not always correct. So you pause. Not because you are avoiding the situation. Not because you are afraid to act. But because you recognize that the state you are in is not the best state for making decisions. And you give yourself time to return to a state where clarity is possible. This does not take long. Sometimes it takes only a few seconds. A few breaths. A few moments of silence. But those few moments can be the difference between a reactive decision and a conscious one. Over time, you begin to recognize the difference. You begin to feel the quality of your thinking. You begin to sense when you are thinking clearly and when you are thinking reactively. And you begin to trust that sense more than you trust the urgency of the moment. This is the shift. From being driven by emotion to being informed by it. From reacting automatically to responding consciously. From repeating the same patterns to choosing differently. It does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. But it begins with noticing. And it continues with practice. And over time, it becomes the foundation of clarity under pressure. Chapter 3: The Illusion of Urgency. There is a pressure that arrives in certain moments, and it carries with it a specific quality. It feels immediate. It feels urgent. It feels as though something must be done right now, and any delay would be a mistake. This feeling is convincing. It does not present itself as a distortion. It presents itself as clarity. As truth. As the accurate reading of a situation that demands action. You may have felt this before. A deadline approaches. A message arrives that requires a response. A conflict emerges that seems to need immediate resolution. In these moments, time begins to feel compressed. What was once spacious becomes narrow. What was once manageable becomes overwhelming. And the voice inside your mind begins to insist that you must act now. This voice is not always wrong. There are moments when urgency is real. When delay would be costly. When action is required immediately. But these moments are rarer than the voice suggests. Most of the time, the urgency you feel is not a reflection of the situation. It is a reflection of how your mind is interpreting the situation. This distinction matters. Because when you believe that urgency is real, you act from within it. You make decisions quickly. You narrow your focus. You eliminate options that seem too slow. And in doing so, you often create the very problem you were trying to avoid. The difficulty is that urgency feels justified. It feels rational. It does not feel like an overreaction. It feels like the appropriate response to a serious situation. And because it feels this way, you do not question it. You simply respond to it. But if you step back and observe carefully, you begin to notice something. The situations that feel most urgent are not always the situations that are most important. Sometimes the most urgent feeling arrives in situations that are relatively minor. Sometimes the most important situations do not feel urgent at all. And sometimes, the feeling of urgency itself is what makes a situation worse. This is the illusion. Not that urgency is never real. But that the feeling of urgency is not a reliable indicator of whether urgency is real. The mind can create a sense of immediate pressure even when no immediate pressure exists. It can take a situation that requires thought and turn it into a situation that feels like it requires instant action. Why does this happen? Why does the mind generate urgency when urgency is not warranted? It happens because the mind is wired to detect threat. And when it detects something that resembles threat, it responds by narrowing your focus and speeding up your sense of time. This is a survival mechanism. In genuinely dangerous situations, this response is useful. It allows you to act quickly without overthinking. But in most situations you face, the threat is not immediate. It is abstract. It is future-oriented. It is social or financial or reputational. And yet, the mind responds as though it is immediate. This is where the confusion begins. The mind does not distinguish well between different types of threat. A difficult conversation can trigger the same urgency response as a physical danger. A mistake at work can create the same internal pressure as a genuine emergency. The sensation is similar. The intensity is similar. But the appropriate response is not. In a genuine emergency, speed is essential. Hesitation can be costly. But in most situations, speed is not essential. In fact, speed is often the problem. It leads to decisions made without sufficient thought. It leads to actions taken without considering consequences. It leads to responses that are reactive rather than deliberate. And yet, when the feeling of urgency arrives, the mind interprets it as a signal that speed is necessary. It tells you that if you do not act now, the opportunity will be lost. It tells you that delay is the same as failure. It tells you that thinking too much is a form of weakness. This is the trap. The feeling convinces you that there is no time to think. And because you believe there is no time to think, you do not think. You simply act. And because you act without thinking, the outcome is often poor. And because the outcome is poor, you create more pressure for yourself. And the cycle continues. You may recognize this pattern in your own experience. You felt pressured. You acted quickly. The result was not what you hoped for. You looked back and realized that if you had taken more time, if you had considered the situation more carefully, you would have chosen differently. But in the moment, it felt as though there was no time. It felt as though action was required immediately. This is not a failure of judgment. It is a failure of perception. The mind misread the situation. It interpreted a situation that required careful thought as a situation that required immediate action. And because the interpretation felt true, you did not question it. This happens more often than most people realize. The mind is constantly evaluating situations and assigning them levels of urgency. And it does not always assign urgency accurately. Sometimes it overestimates. Sometimes it assigns high urgency to situations that are not urgent at all. And sometimes it assigns low urgency to situations that actually do require attention. The question is not whether the mind will do this. The question is whether you will notice when it is doing this. Whether you will recognize that the urgency you feel is not always a reflection of reality. Whether you will pause before acting on the feeling. Most people do not pause. They feel the urgency, and they respond to it. They trust the feeling. They assume that if something feels urgent, it must be urgent. But the feeling is not a reliable guide. The feeling is a response generated by a part of your mind that is designed to keep you safe, not to keep you accurate. This part of your mind is fast. It is automatic. It evaluates situations quickly and pushes you toward action. It does not wait for you to gather all the information. It does not wait for you to consider alternatives. It simply reacts. And because it reacts quickly, it often reacts based on incomplete or distorted information. This is not a flaw. In situations where speed is truly necessary, this system is invaluable. But in situations where speed is not necessary, this system can become a source of poor decisions. It pushes you to act before you are ready. It pushes you to decide before you have enough information. It pushes you to respond based on how the situation feels, rather than how the situation actually is. And the way the situation feels is heavily influenced by your internal state. If you are already stressed, if you are already tired, if you are already feeling overwhelmed, the urgency response is more easily triggered. A situation that would feel manageable on another day suddenly feels critical. A problem that would normally seem minor suddenly feels overwhelming. The situation has not changed. What has changed is your capacity to handle it. But the mind does not always recognize this distinction. Instead, it interprets the intensity of your internal experience as evidence that the external situation is intense. It assumes that if you feel this much pressure, it must be because the situation is truly pressing. But this is not always true. Sometimes the pressure you feel is a reflection of your internal state, not the external situation. This is why the same situation can feel completely different on different days. On one day, it feels manageable. On another day, it feels impossible. The situation is the same. What has changed is your state. And when your state changes, your perception of urgency changes. But if you do not recognize this, you will treat every intense feeling as though it is an accurate reading of the situation. You will act on urgency whenever you feel it. And you will make decisions based on how things feel in the moment, rather than how things actually are. This is one of the primary reasons people make poor decisions under pressure. Not because they lack information. Not because they lack skill. But because they trust the feeling of urgency without questioning whether the urgency is real. There is a difference between real urgency and perceived urgency. Real urgency exists when delay will create a tangible, immediate problem. Perceived urgency exists when your mind interprets a situation as though delay will create a problem, even when it will not. The challenge is that these two types of urgency feel the same. They create the same sensations. They create the same internal pressure. They create the same voice that insists you must act now. And because they feel the same, it is difficult to tell them apart. But if you slow down and examine the situation, you can begin to distinguish between them. You can ask yourself, what will actually happen if I wait? What is the real cost of delay? Is there a tangible deadline, or is the deadline something my mind has created? Most of the time, when you ask these questions honestly, you discover that the deadline is not as immediate as it feels. There is more time than you thought. There is more flexibility than you assumed. The urgency was real in your experience, but it was not real in the situation. This does not mean the situation is unimportant. It does not mean you can ignore it. It simply means that you have more time to think than your initial feeling suggested. And that additional time, even if it is only a few minutes, can make a significant difference in the quality of your decision. But if you do not pause to question the urgency, you will not discover this. You will act on the feeling. You will make the decision quickly. And you will often discover later that the speed was unnecessary. That you rushed when you did not need to rush. That you acted on incomplete information when better information was available. That you chose the first option when a better option would have become clear if you had waited. This is the cost of acting on perceived urgency. Not just that the decision is poor, but that the decision is poor in a way that was preventable. If you had paused. If you had questioned the urgency. If you had given yourself time to think. The outcome would have been different. And yet, in the moment, pausing feels wrong. It feels like hesitation. It feels like weakness. It feels like you are failing to respond appropriately to a serious situation. This is the voice of the urgency response. It is not trying to harm you. It is trying to protect you. But its idea of protection is speed. And speed is not always protective. Sometimes, speed is the opposite of protective. Sometimes, speed is what creates the problem. You act quickly, and the action is poorly chosen, and the poorly chosen action creates consequences that take much longer to resolve than the original problem would have taken to address thoughtfully. This is the hidden cost of urgency. Not just the poor decision in the moment, but the long-term consequences of that poor decision. You save a few minutes by acting quickly, and you create hours or days or weeks of additional problems because the quick action was not the right action. You may have experienced this. You responded to a message immediately, without thinking carefully, and the response created a misunderstanding that took much longer to repair. You made a decision under pressure, and the decision turned out to be costly in ways you did not foresee. You rushed to solve a problem, and the rushed solution created new problems that were more difficult to solve than the original. This is the pattern. The mind tells you that speed is necessary. You act quickly. The quick action is flawed. The flaw creates new problems. The new problems create more pressure. And the cycle continues. Breaking this cycle requires you to question the urgency. To recognize that the feeling of urgency is not always accurate. To pause before acting, even when pausing feels wrong. This is not easy. The urgency response is powerful. It is convincing. It feels like truth. And when it arrives, it does not feel like something to be questioned. It feels like something to be obeyed. But you can learn to recognize it. You can learn to notice the signs. The tightness in your chest. The narrowing of your focus. The voice that insists you must act now. These are not signs that you need to act. These are signs that your urgency response has been activated. And once you recognize that, you have a choice. You can follow the response. Or you can pause and examine whether the urgency is real. Most of the time, when you pause and examine, you discover that the urgency is exaggerated. That there is more time than you thought. That the situation is not as critical as it feels. And that the quality of your decision improves significantly when you give yourself time to think. This does not mean you should delay indefinitely. It does not mean you should avoid action. It means you should distinguish between situations that truly require immediate action and situations that only feel like they require immediate action. The situations that truly require immediate action are rare. Most situations benefit from thought. From consideration. From a moment of pause to ensure that the action you take is the action you actually want to take, rather than the action your urgency response is pushing you toward. But in order to create that pause, you need to recognize when the urgency response has been triggered. And you need to trust that pausing, even briefly, will not cause the disaster your mind is predicting. This is the shift. From reacting to urgency to questioning urgency. From trusting the feeling automatically to examining whether the feeling is accurate. From acting immediately to pausing long enough to consider whether immediate action is actually necessary. This shift does not happen by thinking about it once. It happens by practicing it repeatedly. By noticing, in real time, when the urgency response arrives. By pausing, even when pausing feels uncomfortable. By asking yourself whether the deadline is real or constructed. By giving yourself permission to think, even when your mind is insisting that there is no time to think. Over time, this becomes easier. You begin to recognize the difference between real urgency and perceived urgency. You begin to notice when your mind is amplifying pressure that is not really there. You begin to trust that pausing will not cause disaster. You begin to trust that thinking carefully will produce better outcomes than reacting quickly. But this only happens if you practice. If you notice. If you question. If you pause. Most people do not practice this. They simply react. They feel urgency, and they act on urgency. And they continue to make the same mistakes, over and over, because they never stop to question whether the urgency they feel is accurate. The cost of this is significant. Not just in the quality of individual decisions, but in the cumulative effect of many poor decisions made under the influence of false urgency. Each decision creates consequences. Each consequence creates new situations. Each new situation creates new pressure. And the cycle continues. You cannot eliminate the urgency response. It is automatic. It is hardwired. It will always be there. But you can learn to recognize it. You can learn to distinguish between the feeling of urgency and the reality of urgency. You can learn to pause before acting. And you can learn to make decisions from a place of clarity, rather than a place of reaction. This is not about becoming slow. It is not about avoiding action. It is about ensuring that the actions you take are deliberate. That they are chosen. That they are based on an accurate understanding of the situation, rather than a distorted perception created by the urgency response. The mind will always try to convince you that there is no time. That you must act now. That delay is dangerous. This is what it does. This is how it is designed. But you do not have to believe it every time. You can question it. You can examine it. You can pause long enough to determine whether the urgency is real. And when you do this, you will often discover that the urgency was an illusion. That there was more time than you thought. That the situation was more manageable than it felt. And that the decision you make after pausing is significantly better than the decision you would have made if you had acted immediately. This is the practice. Not eliminating urgency, but recognizing it. Not ignoring pressure, but distinguishing between pressure that is real and pressure that is constructed. Not avoiding action, but ensuring that action is taken at the right time, for the right reasons, with the right level of thought. The situations that feel most urgent are often not the situations that require the fastest response. And the situations that require careful thought often do not announce themselves with intensity. They arrive quietly. They do not demand attention. They do not create pressure. And because they do not create pressure, they are often ignored or postponed. This is the paradox. The mind assigns urgency based on how something feels, not based on how important it actually is. And because of this, you can spend your time reacting to things that feel urgent while neglecting things that are actually important. The only way to break this pattern is to stop trusting urgency as the primary guide for where you place your attention. To recognize that urgency is a feeling, and feelings are not always accurate. To create space between the feeling and the action. To pause. To think. To choose deliberately, rather than reacting automatically. This is the foundation of clarity under pressure. Not the absence of urgency, but the recognition that urgency is not always what it seems. That the mind can create pressure where no pressure exists. That the feeling of needing to act immediately is not the same as actually needing to act immediately. And when you understand this, you begin to reclaim control. Not by suppressing the urgency response, but by recognizing it. By questioning it. By refusing to act on it automatically. By giving yourself the time and space to determine whether the urgency is real before you allow it to dictate your response. This is how you stop repeating the same mistakes. This is how you break the cycle of reactive decisions and regrettable outcomes. This is how you move from being driven by urgency to being informed by it. From being controlled by pressure to choosing how you respond to pressure. It begins with noticing. And it continues with practice. And over time, it becomes the way you operate. Not reacting to every feeling of urgency, but responding to the situations that truly require attention. And giving yourself the time and clarity to make decisions that serve you, rather than decisions that are simply fast. Chapter 4: Creating Space Before the Decision. There is a moment that exists between the stimulus and the response. Between what happens and what you do about it. Between the pressure arriving and the action being taken. This moment is almost invisible. It passes so quickly that most people do not notice it exists. But it is there. And within that moment lies the possibility of choosing differently. Most of the time, this moment is collapsed. Something happens, and you react. There is no pause. No gap. No space for consideration. The response follows the stimulus so quickly that they feel like a single event. You do not experience yourself as choosing. You experience yourself as responding automatically to what the situation demands. This is how most decisions are made under pressure. Not through deliberate thought. Not through careful evaluation. But through automatic response. The situation triggers something inside you, and that something produces an action, and the action happens before you have fully considered whether it is the right action. This is not always a problem. In some situations, automatic responses are useful. They allow you to act quickly without overthinking. They allow you to navigate familiar situations efficiently. But in situations where the stakes are high, where the outcome matters, where a poor decision will have lasting consequences, automatic responses are often not enough. What is needed in those moments is not speed. What is needed is clarity. And clarity does not arise from speed. Clarity arises from space. From the ability to step back, even briefly, and observe the situation without being entirely absorbed by it. This space is not something that exists naturally. It does not appear on its own. The default mode of the mind is to collapse the space. To move directly from stimulus to response without pause. This is efficient in terms of time. But it is not efficient in terms of outcome. Because when you respond automatically, you respond based on habit. Based on impulse. Based on whatever pattern has been established through repetition. And if the pattern is not a good pattern, if the habit is not a useful habit, then the automatic response will not be a useful response. You will act in the way you have always acted. You will make the same mistakes you have always made. And you will wonder, afterward, why you keep repeating the same patterns even though you know better. The reason you repeat them is not because you lack knowledge. The reason is because knowledge does not automatically change behavior. Understanding what you should do is not the same as doing it. Knowing what the right response is does not mean you will choose that response when the moment arrives. What determines your response in the moment is not what you know. What determines your response is whether you have created enough space between the stimulus and the response to allow for choice. If there is no space, there is no choice. There is only reaction. And reaction is not the same as decision. A reaction is automatic. A decision is conscious. A reaction follows a pre-established pattern. A decision considers the specific situation and chooses a response that is appropriate to that situation. A reaction is fast. A decision takes time. Not necessarily a lot of time. But some time. Enough time to interrupt the automatic pattern and create the possibility of something different. This is what space provides. The opportunity to interrupt. To pause. To observe what is happening inside you before you allow it to determine what happens outside you. Most people do not do this. They feel something, and they act on it. They feel pressure, and they respond to the pressure. They feel urgency, and they move quickly. They feel threatened, and they defend. They feel frustrated, and they react with frustration. The feeling becomes the action without any gap between them. This is understandable. It is the way the mind is designed to work. It is meant to be efficient. It is meant to respond quickly. But efficiency is not the same as effectiveness. And in situations where the quality of the decision matters more than the speed of the decision, efficiency can work against you. You may have experienced this. You responded quickly to something, and later you realized that if you had taken even a few seconds to think, you would have responded differently. The information was available. The awareness was available. But you did not access it because you did not create the space to access it. You moved directly from feeling to action, and the action was not the one you would have chosen if you had paused to consider. This is the cost of collapsing the space. Not just that the response is automatic, but that the automatic response is often not the best response. It is simply the fastest response. The most habitual response. The response that requires the least effort. And in moments of pressure, the mind defaults to whatever requires the least effort. It does not have the capacity to evaluate multiple options. It does not have the time to consider alternatives. It simply reaches for the pattern that is most familiar, and it executes that pattern without questioning whether the pattern is appropriate. This is why people repeat the same mistakes under pressure. The pattern is established. The habit is formed. And when pressure arrives, the habit takes over. There is no conscious decision. There is only the automatic execution of the established pattern. Breaking this cycle requires you to create space. To interrupt the automatic flow from stimulus to response. To insert a pause, however brief, between what you feel and what you do about it. This pause is not about hesitation. It is not about avoiding action. It is about ensuring that the action you take is chosen, not reflexive. That it is deliberate, not automatic. That it is appropriate to the situation, not simply the result of habit. But creating this pause is difficult. Because in the moment when it is most needed, it feels least natural. When pressure is high, when emotion is intense, when the situation feels urgent, the last thing the mind wants to do is pause. It wants to act. It wants to resolve. It wants to do something to reduce the pressure. And so it pushes you toward action. It tells you that pausing is dangerous. That delay will make things worse. That thinking too much will cause you to miss the opportunity. This is the voice of the automatic system. It is not trying to harm you. It is trying to protect you by moving you toward action as quickly as possible. But fast action is not always protective. Sometimes, fast action is what creates the problem. And in those situations, the pause is not a delay. It is a prevention. It is what stops you from making a mistake that will take much longer to fix than the pause would have taken. This is the shift in perspective that is needed. To recognize that pausing is not the same as doing nothing. Pausing is doing something. It is creating the conditions for a better decision. It is giving yourself access to clarity that is not available when you are moving too quickly. But in order to create this pause, you need to recognize when you are moving too quickly. You need to notice when the automatic system has taken over. You need to sense when you are being pushed toward action before you are ready. Most people do not notice this. They are inside the experience, and from inside the experience, everything feels necessary. The speed feels appropriate. The urgency feels real. The action feels like the only reasonable response. But if you develop the ability to step back, even slightly, you begin to notice something else. You begin to notice the quality of your thinking. You begin to sense when your mind is clear and when it is reactive. You begin to feel when you are making a conscious choice and when you are simply following a pattern. This awareness does not arise on its own. It is something you have to cultivate. And you cultivate it by practicing attention. By paying attention to what is happening inside you in moments of pressure. By observing the sensations that arise before you act on them. This is not easy. It requires you to observe yourself while you are in the middle of an experience. To maintain a part of your awareness that is not absorbed by the emotion or the urgency. To create a small amount of distance between you and what you are feeling. Most people do not do this naturally. Their attention is entirely on the external situation. On what is happening. On what needs to be done. On what the other person is saying or doing. There is no attention left for observing their internal state. And because there is no attention on the internal state, they do not notice when the internal state has shifted into reactivity. This is where the automatic patterns take over. When you are not paying attention to yourself, you cannot notice when you are being driven by emotion rather than guided by judgment. You cannot recognize when your perception has been distorted. You cannot see that the urgency you feel is not proportional to the situation. And so you act from within that distorted state. You make decisions based on how things feel, not how things are. And the decisions are poor because the foundation they are built on is unstable. Creating space is about stabilizing that foundation. It is about ensuring that when you make a decision, you are making it from a state of clarity rather than a state of reactivity. And the way you ensure this is by pausing long enough to check your state before you act. This does not require a long pause. It does not require you to step away from the situation or take a break. It can be as simple as a single breath, a moment of silence, a brief check-in with yourself to ask, "Am I clear right now? Or am I reacting?" This question alone can be enough to create space. Because asking the question requires you to step back, to observe, to notice. And in that noticing, you create a gap between the feeling and the action. You interrupt the automatic flow. You give yourself the possibility of choosing differently. But most people do not ask this question. They assume that if they feel strongly about something, their feeling must be accurate. They trust the intensity of their emotion as evidence that their perception is correct. But intensity is not the same as accuracy. A feeling can be very strong and still be based on a misreading of the situation. This is why pausing matters. Because the pause gives you the opportunity to check whether what you are feeling is proportional to what is actually happening. Whether the urgency is real or constructed. Whether the threat is immediate or imagined. Whether your response is appropriate or reactive. And when you check, you often discover that the feeling was exaggerated. That the situation was not as critical as it felt. That there was more time than you thought. That the response you were about to give was not the response you actually wanted to give. This discovery is only possible if you pause. If you do not pause, you will act on the exaggerated feeling. You will respond to the constructed urgency. You will react to the imagined threat. And the outcome will reflect the quality of your perception in that moment, which was distorted. The pause corrects the distortion. Not by eliminating the feeling, but by allowing you to observe the feeling without being entirely controlled by it. By creating enough distance that you can see the feeling as a feeling, rather than seeing it as truth. This is a subtle but important distinction. When you are inside a feeling, you experience it as reality. When you have distance from a feeling, you experience it as something that is happening inside you, but not necessarily an accurate reflection of what is happening outside you. This distance is not about detachment. It is not about suppressing emotion. It is about recognizing that emotion is information, but it is not always accurate information. And before you act on it, you need to assess whether it is accurate. The way you assess this is by slowing down. By giving yourself time to observe. By allowing the initial intensity to settle enough that you can see more clearly. This settling does not take long. Sometimes it takes only a few seconds. But those few seconds can make a significant difference. In those few seconds, the intensity of the emotion begins to decrease. Not dramatically. Not completely. But enough that you can begin to see around it. Enough that you can access other perspectives. Enough that you can remember what you actually care about, rather than only what you feel in the moment. This is what space provides. Not the absence of emotion, but the presence of perspective. The ability to hold the emotion without being overwhelmed by it. The capacity to feel strongly while still thinking clearly. Most people believe these two things are incompatible. They believe that if they feel strongly, they cannot think clearly. And if they think clearly, they cannot feel strongly. But this is not true. You can do both. You can feel the full intensity of an emotion and still maintain the clarity to make a good decision. But this is only possible if you create space. Without space, emotion and thought collapse into each other. The emotion distorts the thought. The thought becomes a justification for the emotion. And you end up acting on emotion while believing you are acting on reason. With space, emotion and thought remain distinct. You can feel the emotion. You can acknowledge it. You can understand what it is telling you. But you do not have to act on it immediately. You can consider it alongside other information. You can weigh it. You can determine whether it is the most important factor in the situation, or simply the loudest. This is the practice. Not eliminating emotion from decision-making, but ensuring that emotion is one input among many, rather than the only input. And the way you ensure this is by creating space. By pausing. By allowing yourself time to access the full range of your awareness, rather than only the part that is shouting the loudest. Over time, this becomes easier. You begin to recognize the signs that you are moving too quickly. The tension in your body. The narrowing of your focus. The voice that insists you must act now. These become signals that you need to pause, not signals that you need to speed up. And when you pause, you begin to notice something else. You begin to notice that the quality of your decisions improves. That you make fewer mistakes. That you regret fewer actions. That you feel more in control, not because you are controlling the situation, but because you are choosing your response to the situation. This is the shift. From being reactive to being responsive. From being driven by whatever is most intense in the moment to being guided by what is most important overall. From acting quickly to acting well. It does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. But it begins with the recognition that space is possible. That you can create a pause between stimulus and response. That you do not have to act on every feeling immediately. That taking time to think is not weakness. It is wisdom. The mind will resist this. It will tell you that pausing is dangerous. That speed is necessary. That hesitation will cost you. This is the automatic system defending its territory. It is designed to push you toward action. It does not understand that sometimes the best action is to wait. To observe. To allow clarity to emerge before committing to a response. But you can learn to override this push. Not by fighting it. Not by suppressing it. But by recognizing it. By noticing when it arrives. By understanding that the push toward speed is not always in your best interest. And by choosing, deliberately, to pause anyway. This choice is difficult at first. It feels unnatural. It feels like you are going against every instinct. But the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes. You begin to trust that the pause will not cause disaster. You begin to see that the few seconds you take to think are worth the improved outcome. You begin to value clarity over speed. And once you value clarity over speed, everything changes. You stop rushing. You stop reacting. You stop making decisions from a place of pressure and start making them from a place of presence. You stop allowing your automatic patterns to determine your actions and start choosing your actions consciously. This is not about becoming slow. It is not about overthinking. It is not about avoiding action. It is about ensuring that when you act from the right place. From a place of clarity. From a place of choice. From a place where you have access to your full awareness, not just the part that is reacting to pressure. The space between stimulus and response is where this clarity lives. And creating that space is the foundation of making good decisions under pressure. Not by eliminating pressure. Not by avoiding difficult situations. But by ensuring that when difficult situations arrive, you respond to them consciously, deliberately, and with the full range of your capabilities, rather than simply reacting with whatever pattern happens to be most automatic. Chapter 5: Calm Decisions in Chaotic Moments. There are people who remain steady when everything around them is not. When pressure increases, when uncertainty rises, when others begin to react with visible stress, these people do not. They remain grounded. They remain clear. They do not appear to be suppressing their emotion. They do not appear to be forcing themselves to stay calm. They simply are calm. This is not a natural trait. It is not something they were born with. It is something they have developed. Something they have practiced. Something they have learned through repeated exposure to difficult situations and the deliberate choice to respond to those situations in a particular way. You may have encountered someone like this. In a moment of crisis, when everyone else is moving quickly, speaking urgently, reacting with visible tension, there is one person who remains still. Who speaks slowly. Who does not rush. And somehow, their steadiness affects the entire situation. It creates a sense that perhaps things are not as chaotic as they seem. That perhaps there is time to think. That perhaps panic is not necessary. This quality is not about pretending. It is not about performing calm while feeling chaos internally. It is about actually being calm, even when the external circumstances would seem to justify being otherwise. And the reason this is possible is because these people understand something that most people do not. They understand that calmness is not a response to the situation. Calmness is a response to how you interpret the situation. And interpretation is something you have control over, even when you do not have control over the situation itself. This distinction is critical. Most people believe that calmness is only possible when the situation is manageable, when the stakes are low, when everything is under control. But this is not how calmness works. Calmness is not the result of a calm situation. Calmness is the result of a calm mind. And a calm mind is possible even in a chaotic situation, if you understand where to place your attention. Most people, when faced with a difficult situation, place their attention on everything that is going wrong. On everything that is uncertain. On everything they cannot control. They focus on the potential for things to get worse. On the ways the situation might develop in directions they do not want. On all the variables that are outside their influence. This focus creates anxiety. Because when you focus on what you cannot control, you create a sense of helplessness. And helplessness is one of the primary drivers of stress. The feeling that you are at the mercy of forces you cannot influence. That the outcome depends on things you cannot affect. That no matter what you do, it may not be enough. This feeling is overwhelming. It creates a sense of urgency. It creates pressure. It creates the need to do something, anything, to regain a sense of control. And so people act. They make decisions quickly. They try to force outcomes. They attempt to control variables that are not actually controllable. And in doing so, they often make the situation worse. The people who remain calm do not do this. They do not focus on what they cannot control. They focus on what they can control. And they understand that what they can control is always smaller than what they cannot control. But it is also the only thing that matters. You cannot control how other people respond. You cannot control what has already happened. You cannot control what might happen in the future. You cannot control the broader forces at play in the situation. But you can control how you respond. You can control where you place your attention. You can control the quality of your thinking. You can control whether you act from clarity or from reaction. This is not a small thing. This is everything. Because the quality of your response determines the quality of your outcome, within the range of what is possible. And while you cannot control whether the outcome is what you hoped for, you can control whether your response was the best response you were capable of. This is where calm people place their focus. Not on the outcome, but on the process. Not on what will happen, but on what they are doing right now. Not on the result, but on the response. Most people do the opposite. They fixate on the outcome, on what they want to happen, on what they are afraid will happen. And because the outcome is uncertain, this fixation creates stress. The mind becomes absorbed in trying to predict, control, or prevent something that has not yet occurred. And this absorption takes attention away from the one thing that actually matters, which is the decision being made in the present moment. When you are focused on the outcome, you are not fully present for the process. Your mind is split between what is happening now and what might happen later. And this split reduces your effectiveness. You are not fully engaged with the situation as it is. You are engaged with your projection of what the situation might become. This projection is rarely accurate. The mind tends to imagine worst-case scenarios. It tends to overestimate negative possibilities and underestimate your capacity to handle them. And so the projection creates more stress than the actual situation warrants. The calm mind does not engage with these projections. It recognizes them as mental activity, but it does not treat them as reality. It acknowledges that the future is uncertain, and it accepts that uncertainty rather than trying to eliminate it. And by accepting uncertainty, it frees up attention to focus on what can actually be influenced, which is the present moment. This acceptance is not resignation. It is not giving up. It is not deciding that nothing matters because outcomes are uncertain. It is recognizing that the most effective way to influence outcomes is to focus entirely on the quality of your response right now, rather than dividing your attention between the present and an imagined future. When you focus on the process rather than the outcome, several things change. The first thing that changes is the quality of your attention. You become more present, more focused, more able to see the situation clearly, because you are not looking at it through the filter of what you hope will happen or what you fear will happen. You are simply looking at it as it is. This clarity allows you to notice things you would otherwise miss. Details that are relevant. Possibilities that are available. Options you had not considered. When your mind is calm, it has access to a wider range of perception than when it is stressed. It can see more. It can process more. It can integrate more information. The second thing that changes is the quality of your decisions. When you are not fixated on forcing a particular outcome, you are more flexible. You are more able to adapt. You are more able to respond to the situation as it actually is, rather than as you wish it were. And this flexibility produces better decisions, because the decisions are tailored to reality rather than to preference. The third thing that changes is your emotional state. When you let go of trying to control the outcome, you let go of a significant source of stress. The pressure to make everything turn out a certain way is exhausting. And when you release that pressure, you create space for calmness. Not because the situation has become less difficult, but because you have stopped adding internal difficulty to external difficulty. This is a critical point. Most of the stress people experience is not from the situation itself. It is from their response to the situation. From their resistance to what is happening. From their attempt to force what is not yet happening. From their focus on what they cannot control. When you shift your focus to what you can control, this self-generated stress diminishes. The situation is still difficult. The pressure is still real. But you are no longer fighting against reality. You are working with it. And this shift from fighting to working with creates a sense of calmness, even in the middle of chaos. People who remain calm under pressure have learned this distinction. They have learned that fighting reality is exhausting and ineffective. They have learned that acceptance is not weakness. They have learned that focusing on what you can control is not about ignoring what you cannot control. It is about recognizing where your effort is most useful. And they have learned something else, which is perhaps the most important thing. They have learned that confidence does not come before clarity. It comes after. Most people wait to feel confident before they act. They wait until they are certain. Until they feel ready. Until they feel sure that their decision will produce the outcome they want. But this certainty rarely arrives. And while they wait for it, the situation continues to develop. The pressure continues to build. And eventually, they are forced to act without the confidence they were waiting for, and they act poorly because they are now acting under even more pressure than they were before. The calm mind does not wait for confidence. It recognizes that confidence is not a prerequisite for action. Clarity is the prerequisite. And clarity does not require certainty. Clarity simply requires that you see the situation accurately, that you understand what is within your control, and that you choose a response that is appropriate to what you see. This response may not produce the outcome you hope for. It may not resolve the situation completely. It may not eliminate the uncertainty. But it will be the best response available to you in that moment, given what you know and what you can influence. And that is enough. This is the mindset that allows people to remain calm under pressure. Not the belief that everything will work out. Not the confidence that they will succeed. But the clarity that they are doing what can be done, and the acceptance that the outcome is not entirely within their control. This acceptance does not create passivity. It creates effectiveness. Because when you accept what you cannot control, you stop wasting energy trying to control it. And that energy becomes available for what you can control, which is your attention, your thinking, and your response. Most people do not make this distinction. They treat everything as though it should be controllable. As though if they just think hard enough, plan carefully enough, or work intensely enough, they can determine the outcome. But this is not how reality works. Reality contains too many variables. Too many unknowns. Too many factors that are beyond your influence. And when you operate as though you should be able to control everything, you set yourself up for frustration. Because you will repeatedly encounter situations where your control is limited. Where your effort is not enough. Where the outcome does not match your intention. And each time this happens, it reinforces the feeling that you are not doing enough. That you are not capable enough. That you need to try harder. But trying harder to control what cannot be controlled does not produce better outcomes. It produces exhaustion. It produces stress. It produces the very anxiety that undermines your ability to make good decisions. The alternative is to recognize the limits of your control from the beginning. To acknowledge that there are aspects of every situation that you cannot influence. And to place your focus entirely on the aspects you can influence. This does not mean you ignore the uncontrollable factors. It means you accept them. You factor them into your thinking. You recognize them as constraints. But you do not expend energy trying to change them. You expend energy on what can be changed. This shift in focus is what creates calmness. Not because the situation has become simpler, but because you have stopped fighting a battle that cannot be won. You have stopped trying to control the uncontrollable. And you have directed your attention to where it can actually make a difference. People who are calm under pressure have practiced this redirection. They have trained themselves to notice when their attention is drifting toward what they cannot control, and to bring it back to what they can control. This is not something they do once. It is something they do continuously. Because the mind naturally drifts toward worry. Toward what might go wrong. Toward what is uncertain. And each time the mind drifts, they notice. And they redirect. Not with force. Not with judgment. But with a simple recognition that this drift is not useful. That worrying about what cannot be controlled does not help. That the only thing that helps is focusing on what can be controlled. Over time, this practice becomes automatic. The mind still drifts. But it drifts less often. And when it does drift, it returns more quickly. And the person spends more of their time in a state of calm focus, even when the external situation is chaotic. This is not about suppressing awareness of difficulty. It is not about pretending everything is fine when it is not. It is about maintaining a clear view of what is difficult while refusing to add internal chaos to external chaos. The situation may be chaotic. But your response does not have to be. The situation may be uncertain. But your thinking does not have to be. The situation may be beyond your control. But your attention is always within your control. This is the foundation of calmness under pressure. Not the absence of pressure. But the presence of clarity about where your control begins and ends. And the discipline to keep your focus within that boundary. When you do this, something interesting happens. The calmness you create internally begins to affect the situation externally. Not because you are controlling the situation, but because your calm response influences how others respond. It creates space for them to be calm as well. It demonstrates that panic is not necessary. That there is time to think. That reacting quickly is not the same as responding effectively. This is why calm people often have a disproportionate influence in difficult situations. Not because they are louder. Not because they are more forceful. But because their calmness creates a different quality of space. A space where thinking is possible. Where perspective is available. where people can step back from their immediate reactions and consider what is actually needed. But this influence is not the goal. The goal is not to affect others. The goal is to maintain your own clarity. To ensure that your decisions are made from the best possible state. To give yourself the best chance of responding effectively, regardless of what others are doing. And the way you do this is by focusing on process, not outcome. By accepting what you cannot control. By directing your attention to what you can control. And by recognizing that clarity comes first and confidence follows. You do not need to feel confident to make a good decision. You need to see clearly. You need to understand the situation. You need to recognize your options. You need to choose deliberately. And you need to accept that the outcome is uncertain. This acceptance is not defeat. It is realism. It is recognizing that you live in a world of probabilities, not certainties. That you can influence outcomes, but you cannot guarantee them. That your job is not to control everything. Your job is to respond well to what you can control, and to accept what you cannot. When you operate from this understanding, calmness becomes possible. Not as something you have to achieve, but as something that naturally arises when you stop fighting reality and start working with it. When you stop trying to force outcomes and start focusing on process. When you stop waiting for confidence and start acting from clarity. This is not easy. It requires practice. It requires you to notice when you are drifting into worry about outcomes. When you are fixating on what you cannot control. When you are waiting for certainty that will not arrive. And it requires you to redirect, over and over, back to what is within your control right now. But the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. And the more natural it becomes, the more often you find yourself calm in situations where others are not. Not because you are special. Not because you are immune to pressure. But because you have learned where to place your attention. And you have learned that calmness is not a response to easy situations. It is a response to clear thinking. And clear thinking is always possible, even when the situation is not clear at all. There is a difference between reacting to pressure and responding to it. The difference is not always visible from the outside. Two people can take the same action, and from an external perspective, their behavior may appear identical. But internally, the experience is completely different. One is being pushed by the pressure. The other is choosing how to meet it. This internal difference determines everything. It determines the quality of the decision. It determines how sustainable the response is. It determines whether the person will be able to maintain clarity if the pressure increases, or whether they will collapse into reactivity as the situation becomes more difficult. Most people operate in reactive mode most of the time. They are not choosing their responses. They are being driven by their responses. The pressure arrives, and it triggers something inside them, and that something takes over. They feel the urgency, and they move quickly. They feel the anxiety, and they act to reduce it. They feel the threat, and they defend. The feeling comes first, and the action follows automatically. This is not wrong. It is simply automatic. And automatic responses work well in some situations. But in situations where the stakes are high, where the complexity is significant, where a poor decision will have lasting consequences, automatic responses are often inadequate. What is needed in those moments is not a faster reaction. What is needed is a more conscious response. A response that is chosen. A response that is appropriate to the specific situation. A response that comes from clarity rather than from impulse. But creating this kind of response requires something that most people do not naturally possess. It requires the ability to remain present with discomfort without immediately acting to eliminate it. To feel pressure without being controlled by it. To experience uncertainty without rushing to resolve it prematurely. This capacity is not about tolerance. It is not about enduring more than others can endure. It is about recognizing that discomfort is information, not instruction. That pressure is a signal, not a command. That the feeling of needing to act immediately is not the same as actually needing to act immediately. Most people do not make this distinction. They experience discomfort, and they interpret it as a problem that must be solved right now. They feel pressure, and they assume it means they need to move faster. They feel anxiety, and they believe it means something is wrong and must be fixed immediately. But discomfort is not always a problem. Sometimes discomfort is simply the experience of being in a difficult situation. It does not mean you are handling the situation poorly. It does not mean you need to change what you are doing. It simply means the situation is difficult. And difficult situations feel difficult. This is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that you are engaged with something that matters. The people who remain calm under pressure understand this. They do not interpret discomfort as evidence that they are doing something wrong. They interpret it as evidence that they are doing something difficult. And they allow the discomfort to be present without needing to eliminate it immediately. This allowing is not passive. It is an active choice. It is the choice to remain with the difficulty rather than rushing to escape it. To stay present rather than seeking relief through premature action. To tolerate the uncertainty rather than grasping for false certainty. False certainty is one of the most common traps under pressure. When you cannot tolerate uncertainty, you create certainty artificially. You decide quickly, not because you have enough information, but because deciding feels better than remaining undecided. You commit to a course of action, not because it is clearly the right course, but because committing feels better than staying open. This false certainty provides temporary relief. It reduces the discomfort of not knowing. It creates the feeling that you are in control. But it does not produce good decisions. Because the decisions are made to reduce discomfort, not to respond effectively to the situation. The calm mind does not seek false certainty. It tolerates real uncertainty. It remains open even when openness is uncomfortable. It waits for clarity even when waiting feels wrong. And it trusts that clarity will arrive if given enough space, whereas rushing will only produce the illusion of clarity. This trust is not faith. It is not a belief that everything will work out. It is a recognition based on experience that better decisions come from patience than from haste. That the discomfort of uncertainty is temporary, but the consequences of rushed decisions can be lasting. That it is better to remain uncomfortable for a few more moments than to act prematurely and create a problem that will require much more discomfort to resolve. But developing this trust requires experience. It requires you to practice staying present with uncertainty. To notice when you are rushing to resolve discomfort. To pause even when pausing feels intolerable. And to observe that the disaster you feared would happen if you waited does not actually happen. Most people do not have this experience because they never create the opportunity for it. They always act quickly. They always resolve uncertainty as fast as possible. They never give themselves the chance to discover that they can tolerate more discomfort than they believe they can. That they can remain present longer than feels comfortable. That clarity often arrives just past the point where they would normally have acted. This is the edge where growth happens. Not in the comfortable moments. Not when everything is clear. But in the moments when you feel the urge to act and you choose not to. When you feel the pressure to decide and you choose to wait. When you feel the discomfort of uncertainty and you choose to remain with it rather than escaping into false certainty. Each time you do this, you expand your capacity. You prove to yourself that you can handle more than you thought. That the urgency you feel is not always accurate. That waiting does not always lead to disaster. And this proof changes how you respond to pressure in the future. You become less reactive. Not because you have learned to suppress your reactions, but because you have learned that reactions are not commands. That you can feel the impulse to act without acting on it. That you can experience pressure without being controlled by it. This is a subtle but profound shift. From being at the mercy of your internal state to having agency over how you respond to your internal state. From being pushed around by feelings to being able to observe feelings and choose whether to act on them. Most people never make this shift. They remain reactive throughout their lives. They feel, and they act. They feel more strongly, and they act more quickly. They never develop the capacity to pause, to observe, to choose. And so they continue to make the same kinds of mistakes, over and over, because the pattern never changes. The pattern only changes when you practice changing it. When you deliberately create situations where you feel the urge to act and you choose not to. Where you feel pressure and you choose to slow down rather than speed up. Where you feel uncertainty and you choose to remain present with it rather than rushing to resolve it. This practice is uncomfortable. It goes against every instinct. Your mind will tell you that you are making a mistake. That you are being too slow. That you need to act now. And you will have to override that voice. Not by arguing with it. Not by trying to convince yourself it is wrong. But by simply choosing differently, despite the voice. Over time, the voice becomes quieter. Not because it disappears. But because you stop believing it automatically. You recognize it as the voice of the reactive system. The system that wants speed. That wants certainty. That wants to reduce discomfort as quickly as possible. And you recognize that this system is not always right. That sometimes speed is the problem, not the solution. That sometimes certainty is false, not real. That sometimes discomfort is necessary, not something to be avoided. This recognition does not make the voice go away. But it changes your relationship to the voice. You hear it, but you are not controlled by it. You feel the urge it creates, but you do not automatically act on the urge. You maintain enough distance that you can evaluate whether the urge is serving you, or whether it is simply trying to reduce discomfort in a way that will not actually help. This distance is the key. Without distance, you are inside the experience. You are the urgency. You are the anxiety. You are the pressure. And when you are inside it, you cannot see it clearly. You can only react to it. With distance, you are observing the experience. You notice the urgency without being the urgency. You feel the anxiety without being consumed by it. You sense the pressure without being controlled by it. And this allows you to choose how you respond, rather than simply reacting automatically. Creating this distance is not about detachment. It is not about becoming cold or uncaring. It is not about suppressing emotion. It is about maintaining awareness even in the middle of intense emotion. About keeping a part of your attention free to observe what is happening, rather than being entirely absorbed by what is happening. This is difficult. It requires practice. And it requires you to start small. You do not begin by practicing this in the most intense situations. You begin by practicing it in situations where the stakes are lower. Where the pressure is manageable. Where you have more capacity to observe. You practice noticing when you feel the urge to act. You practice pausing before acting. You practice asking yourself whether the action is necessary right now, or whether it is simply a way to reduce discomfort. You practice tolerating the discomfort for a few more seconds. And you observe what happens. Most of the time, what happens is nothing. The disaster you feared does not arrive. The opportunity you thought you would miss does not disappear. The situation does not collapse because you waited. And you begin to learn that urgency is not always accurate. That you can wait longer than it feels like you can wait. That clarity is worth waiting for. This learning is experiential. You cannot learn it by thinking about it. You can only learn it by doing it. By practicing in real situations. By choosing to pause when you feel the urge to act. By choosing to wait when you feel the pressure to decide. By choosing to remain present when you feel the urge to escape. And each time you practice, you build capacity. The next time pressure arrives, you have a little more ability to stay present with it. A little more ability to observe rather than react. A little more ability to choose rather than being pushed. Over time, this capacity grows. Not because you have eliminated the reactive system, but because you have developed a different system alongside it. A system that can observe, that can pause, that can choose. And gradually, this system becomes stronger. It becomes more accessible. It becomes more reliable. But it never becomes automatic. You always have to choose it. The reactive system is always there. It is always ready to take over. And in moments of high pressure, it will try to take over. It will push you toward speed, toward certainty, toward action. And you will have to notice this push and choose differently. This is the ongoing practice. Not something you master once and then maintain forever, but something you practice continuously. Something you choose again and again. Something that requires vigilance, because the reactive system is always present and always ready to reassert control. But the more you practice, the easier the practice becomes. Not because the reactive system becomes weaker, but because your ability to notice it and choose differently becomes stronger. You become more familiar with the signs. You recognize the feeling of being pushed. You sense when you are starting to move too quickly. And you pause before the momentum builds. This early noticing is critical. Because once the reactive system has fully taken over, it is much harder to regain control. The best time to pause is at the beginning. Before you have committed to action. Before you have built up momentum. Before the automatic pattern has fully engaged. This requires sensitivity. You need to be able to notice subtle shifts in your internal state. The slight increase in tension. The slight narrowing of focus. The slight acceleration in your thoughts. These early signs are easy to miss if you are not paying attention. But if you are paying attention, they provide early warning that the reactive system is beginning to activate. And if you catch it early, you can interrupt it easily. A single breath. A moment of pause. A brief check-in with yourself. This is often enough to prevent the full activation of the reactive pattern. To maintain your ability to choose. To stay in responsive mode rather than slipping into reactive mode. But if you miss the early signs, if you allow the reactive system to fully engage, then interrupting becomes much more difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. You need more space, more time, more deliberate effort to step back and regain perspective. This is why ongoing awareness is so important. Not intense awareness. Not exhausting awareness. Just a background level of attention to your internal state. A gentle noticing of what is happening inside you, even as you attend to what is happening outside you. Most people do not maintain this kind of awareness. Their attention is entirely on the external situation. On what needs to be done. On what others are saying or doing. There is no attention left for noticing their internal state. And so they do not notice when they slip from responsive to reactive. They do not notice when clarity gives way to urgency. They do not notice when they stop choosing and start being pushed. And because they do not notice, they cannot correct. They continue in reactive mode until the situation resolves or until they have made a decision. And only afterward, when the pressure has passed, do they look back and realize they were not as clear as they thought they were. That they acted from reaction, not from choice. That they allowed pressure to dictate their response rather than choosing their response consciously. This realization is useful. But it is not enough. Because if all you do is reflect afterward, the same pattern will repeat. Reflection after the fact does not change what happens in the moment. What changes what happens in the moment is awareness during the moment. And that requires practice. Ongoing practice. The practice of maintaining awareness even when your attention is pulled toward external demands. This is the practice of people who remain calm under pressure. Not that they never feel pressure, but that they maintain awareness of their internal state even when external pressure is high. They notice when they are starting to react. They notice when clarity is beginning to fade. They notice when they are being pushed rather than choosing. And they pause. They redirect. They return to clarity before making decisions from reactivity. This is what allows them to remain steady when others are not. Not superior capacity. Not immunity to pressure. But simply the practice of noticing and choosing. The practice of maintaining awareness. The practice of interrupting reactivity before it takes full control. The practice of returning to clarity, again and again, no matter how many times pressure tries to pull them away from it. There is something else that calm people understand, something that is not immediately obvious. They understand that their calmness is not just for themselves. It affects the entire system they are part of. When one person remains calm in a chaotic situation, that calmness creates a different kind of space for everyone involved. This is not about leadership. It is not about taking charge or directing others. It is simply about being present in a particular way. When you are calm, you are not adding to the chaos. You are not amplifying the urgency. You are not feeding the collective anxiety. And this absence of amplification changes the dynamic. Most people, when they enter a high-pressure situation, absorb the energy of that situation and then reflect it back, often at a higher intensity. They sense the urgency, and they become urgent. They feel the anxiety, and they express anxiety. They notice the chaos, and they add to the chaos. This is not deliberate. It is automatic. But it creates a feedback loop. The pressure increases. The urgency escalates. The situation becomes more chaotic than it needs to be. When you remain calm, you interrupt this feedback loop. You absorb the energy, but you do not reflect it back. You sense the urgency, but you do not become urgent. You feel the pressure, but you do not amplify it. And this interruption affects others. Not because you are telling them to be calm, but because you are demonstrating that calmness is possible. That urgency is not the only response. That there is another way to be present in this situation. This demonstration is powerful. People look to each other for cues about how to interpret situations. When everyone is reacting with visible stress, it reinforces the interpretation that the situation is overwhelming. When one person is calm, it suggests that perhaps the situation is manageable. That perhaps the reaction is disproportionate to the reality. That perhaps there is time to think. This does not mean the situation becomes less difficult. It means the collective interpretation of the difficulty shifts. And when the interpretation shifts, the quality of response shifts. People become more able to think. More able to consider options. More able to make deliberate choices rather than reactive ones. But this only happens if your calmness is genuine. If you are forcing calmness while feeling chaos internally, others will sense the disconnection. They will sense that something is not quite right. And rather than creating space, this forced calmness creates unease. Genuine calmness comes from the practices already described. From focusing on what you can control. From accepting what you cannot control. From staying present with discomfort rather than rushing to eliminate it. From maintaining awareness of your internal state. From choosing your response rather than being pushed by your reaction. When calmness comes from these practices, it is stable. It does not require effort to maintain. It does not require you to suppress what you are feeling. It is simply the natural state that arises when you are not fighting reality, not rushing toward false certainty, not trying to control what cannot be controlled. And this natural state affects others naturally. Not through your words. Not through your actions. But through your presence. Through the quality of your attention. Through the way you hold the situation without being overwhelmed by it. This is why calm people often find themselves in positions of informal influence during crises. Not because they seek influence. Not because they take charge. But because others naturally orient toward their steadiness. They recognize, often unconsciously, that this person sees something they do not. That this person has access to clarity they have lost. That this person is operating from a different place than panic or urgency. And in orienting toward this steadiness, they create the possibility of accessing it themselves. They begin to notice that they too can slow down. That they too can pause before acting. That they too can choose how to respond rather than simply reacting. This transmission of calmness is not something you can force. You cannot make others be calm. You cannot convince them through argument. You can only be calm yourself and allow that calmness to be available if they are ready to receive it. Sometimes they are ready. Sometimes they are not. Sometimes the pressure is so high and the reactivity so entrenched that no amount of steadiness will shift the collective state. And in those moments, all you can do is maintain your own clarity. Make your own decisions from that clarity. And allow the situation to unfold as it will. This is the final aspect of calm under pressure. Recognizing that you cannot control how others respond. That you cannot determine whether the situation will resolve favorably. That you cannot guarantee any outcome beyond the quality of your own response. And accepting this. Not as defeat. Not as resignation. But as simple reality. You do what you can do. You remain as clear as you can remain. You make the best decisions available to you. And you let go of the rest. This letting go is not giving up. It is recognizing the boundaries of your influence. And within those boundaries, you do everything possible. You give your full attention. You apply everything you have learned. You remain present. You remain conscious. You remain calm. But beyond those boundaries, you accept that the outcome is not entirely up to you. That other factors are at play. That uncertainty is inherent. That control is limited. And in this acceptance, you find freedom. The freedom to focus entirely on what you can affect. The freedom to respond from clarity rather than from the desperate need to force an outcome. The freedom to be present without being overwhelmed. The freedom to remain calm, even when the world around you is not calm at all. This is what calm under pressure looks like. Not absence of feeling. Not immunity to stress. Not supernatural composure. But simply the practice of noticing, choosing, accepting. The practice of maintaining awareness. The practice of focusing on process rather than outcome. The practice of returning to clarity, over and over, no matter how many times pressure tries to pull you away. It is available to anyone willing to practice it. It does not require special talent. It does not require perfect conditions. It only requires the willingness to notice when you are reactive, to pause before acting, to focus on what you can control, and to accept what you cannot. This is the foundation. And on this foundation, clarity becomes possible, even in chaos. Calm becomes possible, even in crisis. And good decisions become possible, even under pressure. This is the foundation. And on this foundation, clarity becomes possible, even in chaos. Calm becomes possible, even in crisis. And good decisions become possible, even under pressure. The practice does not end when the pressure passes. In fact, the moments after pressure are just as important as the moments during pressure. Because this is when you have the opportunity to learn. To observe what happened. To notice where you maintained clarity and where you lost it. To recognize where you made conscious choices and where you reacted automatically. Most people do not do this kind of review. When the pressure passes, they simply move on. They feel relief that the difficult moment is over, and they do not want to revisit it. Or they judge themselves harshly for mistakes they made, without extracting useful information from those mistakes. Or they tell themselves a simplified story about what happened, one that makes them feel better but does not reflect the full complexity of the experience. None of these approaches support growth. Relief without reflection means you do not learn. Harsh judgment without understanding means you reinforce shame rather than building capacity. Simplified stories mean you miss the nuanced details that would actually help you respond differently next time. What supports growth is honest observation. Looking back at the experience without either defending yourself or attacking yourself. Simply noticing what happened. What you felt. What you thought. What you did. And what the results were. This kind of observation is not easy. It requires you to be honest about moments when you were not at your best. Moments when you reacted rather than responded. Moments when you let urgency override judgment. Moments when you made decisions from pressure rather than from clarity. But this honesty is not about self-criticism. It is about accuracy. You cannot improve what you do not see clearly. And you cannot see clearly if you are either making excuses or punishing yourself. You need to see what actually happened, as neutrally as possible, so that you can recognize the pattern. And once you recognize the pattern, you can begin to interrupt it. Not by trying harder. Not by forcing yourself to be different. But by noticing earlier. By catching the reactive pattern before it fully engages. By creating space before you need it, rather than trying to create space after you have already lost clarity. This is the progression. First, you notice after the fact. You look back and see that you reacted. Then you notice sooner. You recognize the reactivity while it is still happening, but after you have already started acting on it. Then you notice earlier still. You catch the reactive impulse before you act on it. And eventually, you notice at the very beginning. You sense the first signs of the reactive pattern activating, and you pause before it can take hold. This progression does not happen quickly. It happens gradually, through repeated practice. Through many situations where you notice, choose, and observe the results. Through many moments of pausing when you feel the urge to act. Through many instances of staying present with discomfort rather than rushing to eliminate it. But each time you practice, you build capacity. And each time you build capacity, the next situation becomes slightly more manageable. Not because situations become easier, but because you become more skilled at maintaining clarity within them. This skill is not visible from the outside. No one can see that you paused before responding. No one can tell that you chose your action rather than reacting automatically. No one knows that you maintained awareness of your internal state while attending to external demands. From the outside, you simply appear calm, steady, clear. But from the inside, you know the difference. You know that this clarity was not automatic. That it required attention. That it required practice. That it required the willingness to notice when you were becoming reactive and to choose differently. And this knowledge matters. Not because you need recognition for your effort, but because it reinforces the practice. Each time you successfully maintain clarity under pressure, you prove to yourself that it is possible. That you can do it. That the practice works. And this proof builds confidence. Not the false confidence that comes from believing everything will work out, but the real confidence that comes from knowing you can remain clear even when the outcome is uncertain. That you can make good decisions even when the situation is difficult. That you can stay present even when every instinct is telling you to react. This is the confidence that matters. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in your capacity to respond well, regardless of outcomes. Confidence that you will not be overwhelmed. That you will not lose yourself. That you will remain conscious and deliberate, even under significant pressure. This confidence does not eliminate pressure. It does not make difficult situations easy. But it changes your relationship to pressure. You are no longer afraid of it. You are no longer trying to avoid it. You recognize it as part of engaging with things that matter. And you trust that you have the capacity to meet it clearly. This trust is earned. It comes from practice. From repeatedly choosing clarity over reactivity. From repeatedly pausing when you feel the urge to rush. From repeatedly focusing on what you can control rather than what you cannot. From repeatedly accepting uncertainty rather than grasping for false certainty. Each time you do these things, you strengthen the foundation. And the stronger the foundation, the more pressure you can handle without losing clarity. Not because you have become immune to pressure, but because you have developed the capacity to remain present with it, to work with it, to respond to it consciously rather than being controlled by it. This is the work. Not achieving perfect calmness. Not eliminating all reactivity. Not becoming someone who never feels pressure. But becoming someone who can remain clear even when pressure is present. Someone who can choose even when the urge to react is strong. Someone who can maintain awareness even when the situation is chaotic. This work continues. There is no point at which you have mastered it completely. There is no state of permanent clarity that, once achieved, never requires maintenance. The practice is ongoing. The noticing is ongoing. The choosing is ongoing. But the practice becomes more natural over time. The noticing becomes easier. The choosing becomes more automatic, though it always remains a choice. And the clarity that once required significant effort to maintain begins to feel more like your natural state, even under pressure. This is the possibility available to anyone willing to practice. Not superhuman composure. Not immunity to stress. But simply the ability to remain clear when clarity matters most. To stay present when presence is most difficult. To choose consciously when the easiest path would be to react automatically. This ability changes everything. It changes the quality of your decisions. It changes the quality of your relationships. It changes how you experience difficult situations. It changes who you become over time. And it all begins with noticing. With pausing. With choosing. With practicing, again and again, until clarity under pressure becomes not just a possibility, but a reliable capacity you can access whenever you need it.